In 1972, approximately, because Richard McGuire was a client of mine at the time. I was still an accountant, CPA. And his records were subpoenaed by the Watergate grand jury. They went far beyond just the Nixon tapes. They were going after everybody on both sides. I suppose to show, lack of bias, they were going after Democrats as well. And as the years went on, another guy who will appear in this presentation is a guy by the name of G. Gordon Liddy. Does anybody remember him? Well, see if you agree. I've been mistaken for Liddy a number of times because we're both in Washington, D.C. And then in 1998, some 30 years after this series of events evolved, absolutely unconnected with any of this, just totally coincidentally, because as Mike said, we're a merger and acquisition investment bank. One of the things that these types of investment banks do is a lot of valuation work. And we at the time, and continue to do probably the plurality of all business valuations in the Middle Atlantic states. So they hired us, and since I was the old guy, they hired me to value the Nixon Watergate tapes. And these things are totally unconnected. They just happen that way. And then I guess the culminating event is having dinner and maybe 2 glasses of wine too many with Sam Asghar last night, who's going to be talking right after I do, and learning even more about Woodstock and things I didn't know. This is the closest I'll ever get to Woodstock, and that feeling is this. Although I tell you, as a young man, before I became an accountant, I actually played drums professionally for a number of years, including rock and a couple of records that were recorded for RCA just as a backup. So in any event, that's some of the stuff that I wanted to talk about. So the rule of law is basically a principle that I think particularly this audience, I think most of you attorneys are familiar with. It's not novel in the United States. It goes back to the Magna Carta, as a matter of fact. And it says that, we're not bossed around by kings and emperors and so forth. We're bossed around, so to speak, by law, and everybody has to be treated equally under the law. I was observing some of the presentations earlier, especially on the environmental area, that we need to be very careful. And this is a tangent I didn't intend to go off on, and I won't go very far. But when you see things like retroactive, liability for things that were legal at the time, we need to be very careful as our country becomes probably necessarily more socialistic because we're getting big and more complex society. We need to be careful we keep referring back to that Bill of Rights and those amendments, because a few of those things sound strikingly to me like there may be some constitutional issues involved. But I'm not an attorney. I'll leave that up to you guys. So in any event, I think the distance between Woodstock, Nixon's election in '68, Woodstock, which took place in '69, about 10 months later, the First Amendment issues that were informally involved in Woodstock, Sam's dad, who basically was defending the right of assembly and free speech, and the Fifth Amendment issues, which rose in 1994 and 1998, are kind of interesting because they're demonstrative of the rule of law and how in our country the rule of law does prevail. So both sides sort of won. There was a culture clash going on in the 60s and again in the 90s. And the culture clash, you have to remember that when Nixon ran for president, he ran, you guys will probably recall, under a slogan called the silent majority. And there was his group of people, or at least he claimed there were, and they were generally conservative in their view and political view and cultural views. And then there was another group of people in '68 and '69 who were the so-called Woodstock generation, really the early baby boomers who were born between about probably 1946 and 1957. I had guessed the average age demographic there was probably 17 to 22, and Sam confirmed that for me last night. It was something in those general vicinity. So even though these were a bunch of young people, they did reflect one half of the cultural divide that was very significant in our country at the time. There was I remember I don't know whether this is censored or not, but I remember my favorite bumper sticker was "Make Love Not War." And I always thought that was a great bumper sticker, as a matter of fact. So there were these two different divisions going on. Nixon was elected again as the kind of representative of the silent majority, the conservative people. In '69, and it's hard to say that Woodstock was in retaliation because it was basically a musical festival, and it was done for money, at least in terms of the promoters. But on the other hand, it did reflect that sort of cultural divide between the two parts of the country. So, there's no direct line of retaliation, probably somewhat coincidental, but also politically speaking, it was very much the opposite side of the ledger. The First Amendment, I think we've seen that, we'll probably see it 2 or 3 times, but the aspect of the First Amendment that Sam's father was defending at the time informally was obviously the right of peaceful assembly. 1971, Nixon began recording his conversations in the White House. And it wasn't generally known, and I don't think it's known now, that wasn't new. That had been done since Roosevelt's time, since they actually had what was the fundamentals of modern recording equipment. So every president had done this. Why it didn't come up before the Senate Watergate committee before, it required an aide to actually mention to them that he had recorded tapes, is a puzzlement because all presidents had these. They had just never become a political issue before. This is a picture of Nixon in the actual tape that I'm going to play for you at the end of this. No, that's not true. It's just a picture of Nixon. Now, what do you guys think? Any resemblance? I literally have many times, because we're both from D.C., and so many times I've been mistaken for him. So there were about 18 really painful months that took place between July '73 and July '74. And July '73, Butterfield, who was one of his aides at the time, along with Colson and others, actually mentioned to the Watergate Committee about the recordings. Then the House Judiciary Committee began hearing impeachments, and in fact, it passed the House, and Nixon at the time knew there were only 4 senators opposed to impeachment. So impeachment was pretty guaranteed in Nixon's case, which led to his resignation shortly thereafter in August 1974. November '73, 18 minutes of the tape, you guys may recall this in history, the ones that are old enough or have read about it, went missing. His secretary, Rosemary Wood, claimed, this is an actual picture of her erasing the tapes. No, it's not. She claimed that her foot hit the wrong button or something like that. The way they used to do this is you operated these tapes, I guess, with a kind of a foot pedal. And so she claimed her foot hit it, and maybe it did. I mean, we'll never know. But the problem is Congress then became really alarmed at that point. And they passed a rule. Well, first of all, the Supreme Court ordered Nixon to take over the tapes, and then Nixon does resign then in August, and then Ford pardons him, which is a very unpopular pardon at the time, but I think arguably probably the right thing to do because the country was in enormous turmoil at that time. December 19th, the Presidential Recordings and Material Preservation Act was passed, and it was interesting because it was an act, and of course this is not uncommon in our Congress, but it usually has to do with pork barrel kind of legislation. This act was passed specifically for Richard Nixon and no one else. So he was kind of memorialized in that act by this particular act. The Nixon immediately filed a protest, or immediately filed with the Federal District Court seeking an injunction against the act, and he raised a bunch of constitutional issues. He said it violated separation of powers, it invaded his privacy, it was against presidential privilege, it violated and somehow the First Amendment right of association. I'm not sure what the case was that was being made there was. and the Bill of Attainder clause, which is that you basically can't try somebody just because you feel like it, because you're the sovereign. So in any event, the Supreme Court shot him down right across they denied every one of these. So right at the same time, his attorneys filed a Fifth Amendment claim. And the Fifth Amendment claim said, look, under the Fifth Amendment, like the First Amendment, like most of the Bill of Rights, if you read each of the amendments, there'll be a number of things, as the speaker on the environmental area pointed out, included in each one of these amendments. They're not, they deal with similar themes, but they don't deal with specific or sole issues. So he filed a claim that under the Fifth Amendment is basically eminent domain. And under the eminent domain rules, it says that, you can take a U.S. citizen's property. That's okay if there's a good reason and it's for the benefit of the public. But you have to provide just compensation in the taking. So the taking aspect of the Fifth Amendment, actually in 1994, I guess it was, in 1992, Nixon's claim there was approved. Now you had the problem that this was 1992, and the tapes were actually taken under that presidential act I mentioned in 1974. So 18 years had passed, and now you had to come up with a value for presidential property. And incidentally, there were 3,700 hours of tapes, but they were known as the tapes, but included in there were all sorts of presidential documents. There were photos, there were motion picture photos, there were audio tapes, there were, all sorts of things in there. But they became known as the tapes and forever will be known as the tapes. So now you had the problem was, how do you figure out the value of something like this in 1974? And under the law, when a damages expert has to compute value, he has to compute value as of the date of taking. Now, typically in the cases I've testified in, whatever the date of that the event occurred which caused the damages. And typically in the cases I've been involved in, that a couple of years have passed, but 18 years is a long time. So everything that had to be done as if it was being done in 1974. So the government said that, or the Nixon estate basically said that they could have been commercially exploited, these tapes. I'm going to show you how we did that in a moment. The government says that any argument about commercial value is highly speculative, and under a lot of the case law surrounding eminent domain and the justification of the value of property says that speculative estimates of value are not appropriate. So the government took the position that commercial exploitation of the tapes was speculative. The estate said, no, it wasn't. He really could have done this stuff because he was no longer president after 1974, and he would have had the time to do it. So the Nixon experts claimed the tapes were worth $35.5 million. I was the expert, along with a lot of support. And the point, again, that the 8-track tapes, I guess these are 8-track tapes on here, is making is that as all this stuff was done, you had to pretend it was 1974. So how was this calculation made? Well, there are 3 ways that you can calculate the value of property, or the value of an asset, basically. One is you look at similar property that was bought and sold, and you try to compare that to the subject property and see if that's suggestive of a value. And that's usually where that data is available is the most reliable information. But nobody had done this with presidential tapes at this point, especially a tape of a president who had been impeached. So that theory kind of fell to the wayside. And a second method of the 3 methods is you can, all right, let me go look at some public companies, for instance, that have public stock markets, and so you can get an estimate of what the value of those companies are and the value of their assets are, and see how they compare with the subject matter. Well, again, there's no such thing as a public company that, as the tapes and the records and so forth of a president of the United States. So the remaining method is the the present value of future income. And so to give you an idea of how that works, if I have something that has a value of $5,500 a year from now, and I expect a 10% return, then its present value is $5,000, because $5,000 plus 10% is $5,500. So the approach was to see all the things that Nixon could have done with the tapes. That, for instance, he could have done a book. And in each of these instances, there were subject matter experts. I'm not an expert on books, and I'm not an expert on Broadway plays and so forth. So in each of these cases, there were subject matter experts who were hired to develop, probably more accurately, to tell me what they would have done and how they would have done it. And each one of them were experts. I remember one of the guy who did the book was Stephen King's publisher or editor, as I recall, and each one of these people were, pretty well-known people in their field. So we went through and we said, well, if he had done a book, it would have sold for this, and the royalties would have been that. And if he had done a play, this is the way a playwright is, or a producer playwright is normally paid. If he had sold the tapes in part to archival agencies like libraries and things like that, this is what they were selling for in 1974, and so on. And so each one of these commercial exploitation theories was developed. I mean, there was a book 5 inches thick with all of this stuff in it, and numbers were attached to it. A present value was assigned to it, and that's the way the $35.5 million was determined. And so that was, the Nixon estate. Nixon, by this time, of course, was dead. That was the Nixon estate presentation of value. So there is another aspect that entered into it, and this was pretty interesting, is the magic of compound interest. The value of the tapes was $35.5 million in 1974 dollars. But under just compensation, the awardee is entitled to the interest in effect, or if you want, the inflationary aspect of the dollars. So it could have been done in several ways. At 4%, which was pretty conservative and barely, pretty much amounted to the rate of inflation during that period of time, the tapes now in 1998 would have been worth $90 million. At 10%, they would have been worth $350 million. And if you use the average return on the S&P index, they would have been worth $1.5 trillion. Now, I doubt the government would have ever settled for $1.5 trillion, and I doubt the judge would have ever awarded $1.5 trillion. What happened is, I think everybody here, I'd like to think it was my brilliance and the brilliance of the attorneys and everything that got to $35 million, but they did settle on $35 million. The government and Nixon agreed to it, the Nixon estate agreed to it. And I think the reason why, probably pragmatically, was nobody knew what to do with this thing. They knew that there was a just compensation due. Nobody really knew how to do this. They came up with a number. The estate was happy. The government realized it had a risk, and the risk could have been $350 million to up to $1 trillion. And so everybody said, let's stop arguing with each other. Can't we just get together and talk? And they did that, and they settled. Now, the final part about all this is that there's a tape. I don't know, were we successful, Mary? Were we successful? I was going to, there's a handout of the transcript of this tape, but let me give you background before we turn it on. This tape was presented during the trial, and I know I was one of a dozen people that ever heard this tape prior to about 2009 when it was released publicly. So out of 3,700 hours of tape was played in the trial. Next question, why did they pick the 3,700 hours? Flaws in the tape, and the government said, we want to demonstrate the audio flaws in the tape. Well, in point of fact, the judge in the U.S. District Court was an African-American judge. And you listen to the tape and tell me why you think this was presented in trial if the tape comes on. We found this on YouTube the other night, so.
Time for tonight's rewrite. For those who remain unsure of who is the worst president in American history, recently released audio tapes should permanently settle the question. This is a conversation between former White House senior advisor Charles Colson and the 37th President of the United States, Richard M. Nixon.
I've always had a little prejudice. I have not prejudice in the sense that all Americans recognize it. You know, that all people have certain traits. The Jews have certain traits. The Irish have certain. Virtually every Irish I know is mainly Irish. That's a sort of natural trait. Particularly the real Irish. And they do very good things. The Italians, of course, just don't have their heads screwed on that. And they're wonderful people. And the Jews have a very aggressive, embracing, conscious personalities, but they're just able people. I didn't notice any Jewish names in our coming back from Vietnam. Well, they also have a flyer. That's one thing. They have our territory.
And then there is this conversation between Nixon and his secretary, Rosemary Woods, about Secretary of State William Rogers.
Bill Rogers has got somewhat of a, and to his credit, it's a decent feeling of somewhat of a sort of blind spot of black, because he's, you know, been in the RP and all the rest. He says, well, they're coming along, and then after all, they're going to strengthen our country in the end, because they're strong physically, and some of them are smart and so forth. So my own view is that I think he's right if you're talking in terms of 500 years. I don't think it's wrong in terms of 50 years. What has to happen is that they have to be frankly inbred. That's the only thing that's going to do it, Rose.
The tapes were recorded in February and March of 1973, more than a year before Nixon resigned due to the Watergate scandal, and just after he surrendered in a war that he had needlessly prolonged that killed over 58,000 American soldiers and accomplished absolutely nothing. That's nearly 10 times the number of American soldiers who've given their lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's also this exchange between the president and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger.
The emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union is not an objective of American foreign policy. And if they put Jews into gas chambers in the Soviet Union, it is not an American concern, maybe a humanitarian concern. But we can't go off the world because it.
That's right. Rewind the DVR if you have to. You just heard the racist, anti-Semitic President of the United States agree with his Jewish national security advisor that if the Soviets put Jews into gas chambers, it should not concern us. Such was the casual evil of the banter in the Nixon Oval Office. So the rewrite tonight is yours. All of you who came of age after the Nixon presidency, who have some other name at the top of your list of worst presidents, need to write the word Nixon over whatever name you mistakenly have listed as the worst president in history.
I guess he felt strongly about that. So in any event, that concludes the presentation. Anyway, thank you guys very much. It's been my pleasure.